We're here in Evelyn's, do you say Slome?
Yeah.
Slome Caru's house, or her mother's house.
Say Evelyn Slome's house.
Evelyn Slome's house, 253 Broad Street, Portsmouth, and it's May 30, 2003. So you were starting to tell me about your dad and where he was born and so on.
My dad was born in Richmond, Maine. I just put it there. I think, does that hold it? Yeah. My dad, Ben Slome, was born in Richmond, Maine. He probably, I don't know when. He died at 86 3 years ago. I'm not really good at math. And I have here, his family and his family history as given, and I'd be happy to make copies and send it to you. This is really a much more detailed history. And I would be happy to do that for you, because this is what my father reported to me. My dad, as he reported it to me, his parents, I remember, learned English in the old country so that they would be able to communicate when they got to the United States. And indeed, according to my dad, for a while they had family kept letters addressed to the Shapiro family in Lewiston, Maine, spelled one word. And I don't know how young his parents were when they came here. I don't even know if they were married when they came here. But ultimately they married, and two sisters, my grandmother Fanny and her sister Rose, married two brothers. My dad's father's name was, I believe, Charles. I never knew him. And his brother Abe. We don't spell our names the same way, so it gets a little confusing. In any event, I guess the family was established in the Bangor area or in Lewiston, Auburn, and to make a living, if you go into the small town of Richmond, you might still see the building where my grandfather and grandmother ran a mom and pop store. And that's where my father and his sister were born. All I know is that their family was established far more in Maine than I think I had ever thought they had been. For my dad's grandfather to be buried in Maine is kind of unusual, someplace in Gardner. As I understand it, there were a passel of kids in the Shapiro family. My own experiences of them was that there was a family, Shapiros, who married a Stern family that was based, I believe, in Waterville. And they had the town department store, not the town general store, but the town department store. And that was the sister, Florence Shapiro Stern, and she, I believe, had a brother whom we all call Fat Allen. Allen had to have weighed at least 350 pounds, and I guess he was some sort of lender up there. And I remember from my childhood, because we went up on several occasions to visit. There was also a family with, I want to say 5 sons, based in Lewiston, Auburn, and the wife of that family is still available, one of my mother's counterparts. Her name, I believe, is Esther, but it's Mrs. Isidore Shapiro. Her husband was, I believe, principal of the high school in Lewiston or Lewiston, Auburn for many years. And I, a few years ago, was COO of Hebron Academy and had never seen these people as an adult, and called and found that my father's cousin had died, and that the mother had stayed on there. Of these 5 boys, it's my understanding that most, if not all of them, went to the University of Maine. 1 or 2 of them played football for the University of Maine. One who was kind of a playboy and ne'er-do-well, who married late in life, recently died, Uncle Joe or Cousin Joe, leaving a humongous fortune. Somehow he was the middleman for Foster Grant, either for Foster Grant's seconds, and he had all of New England as a territory, or whatever. All I know is Joe made shitloads of money and died childless and left his family fortune, or his own fortune, to charities in Boston. That was about 3 years ago. He was probably the oldest in the family, and he was the playboy. So, I mean, that's what I remember about that piece of the family, because as in most families, you go with one or the other side of your family. And women tend to prevail in whose family is going to be primary. In any event, the Shapiro family is up there. I would be happy to send this stuff to you. And I've been fascinated, but truly have not had a lot of time to spend looking into this. Unlike Roz Rosenblatt, who spent forever doing genealogy of the Foster family, which is my father's, is connected through my father's family, and that's a totally different story. Anyway, there is in Crossing Lines, which is very hard to come by, reference to 3, in Maine, obviously everything was rural, communities in Maine, Calais, I think Lewiston, Auburn, and probably Bangor. And what it was like for the Jewish communities there, and how there was more or less discrimination, and it seemed to be the farther you were from civilization, like Calais, the less discrimination there was. There's some reference to my dad's family in there in some places. But that's what I can tell you about Maine.
Do you have any, did you hear as you were growing up, did you hear why?
You can't taste that.
No, I'm not going to.
Okay.
I promise you. I'm going to write down the name of it.
Yeah.
But did you hear why these people went to Maine? I mean, everybody else was going to the Lower East Side. And
First of all, my guess is they didn't land in New York. My assumption is they landed in Boston. Or, again, I don't know how early they came over. Well, these people, one of these people, probably this guy here, died and was buried in the United States. So, yeah. So they may have come over early and when there were far less organized entry points, like massive immigration points as in Ellis Island. I know my mother's father came to Boston, I believe. Why there? I don't know. It was familiar. Perhaps it was cold. Perhaps they got off the train and got a job as peddlers in Maine. I know that when my grandparents opened the store in Richmond, there was a small white Russian community there. And they spoke the language, and it made sense. But for them to go there. But why in the beginning? I have no idea why anybody would want to. They weren't probably farmers. My guess is that there was somebody before them. How the first person got to Bangor or Lewiston, Auburn, damned if I know. Maybe it's in one of the family histories. And as I said, I'd be happy to Xerox that for you. You know, I'm delighted that they did, because I can't imagine growing up in a city. I mean, I've lived most of my adult life in cities, but I don't know. There were thriving Jewish communities in not so much. I don't know anything about Portland, but farther north, Lewiston, Auburn had a Jewish community, and Bangor had one as well. Why there? Damned if I know.
And you know, you're saying none of these people were farmers. I mean, for the most part,
they were all peddlers,
they were peddlers,
merchants.
Store owners.
That's what I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, in my dad's generation, everybody I think that I knew was college educated. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It was just clearly expected that you were going to go to college and wear a shirt and tie and carry a pencil instead of whatever. I don't know that much about either of his families. I get the sense that this family was this family's very smart. Grammy Slome's family was, I think, very smart. I mean, my aunt went to Smith, and my dad left MIT during the Depression because he had no money, and all the cousins went to school. So my assumption is that they brought a lot genetically to the table. And that's basically what I know about the family. I mean, I would put you in touch with the folks who used to be in Waterville, but they've died and left. And there hasn't been a lot of continuity of contact because the deaths were somewhat unexpected. But I know that my father's, well, his own parents I don't think my grandfather was a very strong man, and I certainly don't think physically, constitutionally, or in terms of being aggressive or a go-getter, because when my dad was fairly young, they moved to New Bedford, where both parents had family and hooked up with family down there, and again ran a mom and pop store, but were really quite poor. The family in New Bedford, on the other hand, with both Slomes and Shapiros, I think did fairly well, not certainly to become wealthy, but to be fairly comfortable in the middle class. At one point, Dad talked about my grandmother had a bunch of brothers, and one of them, and the brothers bought scallop boats. And Grammy, who had, I mean, she worked her ass off. She had, I think she managed a rooming house and rented out rooms and had boarders, and she and her husband ran a mom and pop store. And my father talks about having a paper route when he was whatever and helping the milkman and what all when he was a little kid. But at one point, Grammy somehow decided that she would get enough money together to go into a scallop boat with her Uncle Willie, or my father's Uncle Willie, I guess one of her brothers. Of all of her siblings and all of her relatives, he's the only one who couldn't manage his way out of a paper bag. So they went belly up, and Willie wasn't a manager, but Dad used to talk about going out on the scallop boat. The rest of the family that was in the scallop business sold their fleet, and did well, and it subsequently moved to the Chesapeake Bay area. There's another part of the family. There's many parts of it. My dad's family is far more interesting. In Newport, Rhode Island, there is another Slome member, now no longer Shapiro. And they had 3 sons, Stanley, Earl, and Aaron. Actually, Aaron and Earl just died about within a month of each other, within the last couple of months. Stanley anyway, their dad and my grandfather were siblings. And somehow they got I think his dad became a printer, but they got to be very civic-minded and very involved in the local community. And I think he went into printing ultimately because his sons took over the business. One of them became a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, but the other 2 took over the business. And ended up in Newport, or perhaps were always in Newport. Mm-hmm. And have a tradition. I mean, the Newport Public Cemetery has a Jewish section, which is really sort of fascinating. And most recently, the daughter-in-law, who would have been my father's cousin-in-law, was the first woman elected president of the Truro Synagogue, even though she couldn't sit on the first floor, which I think is fascinating. But their 3, well, Earl was not that. Stanley and Earl and Aaron both went to Providence College and were boosters and jocks and all the other things. So that was another part of my father's family. Then you go to the western part of New Hampshire, and there is a family in Keene called Stone.
Yeah, you mentioned was it Gordon?
My father's
Stone?
Gordon Stone. I was trying to remember the name. My mother now is too gaga. She isn't gone, but she's sort of in and out, and she's so sensorially deprived because she can't hear that it's very hard for her to stay connected, so she's withdrawing more. But there is a large Stone family based in the Keene area, and that was my father's family. And they apparently settled and did whatever people do in Keene. Somebody in that family had a coal yard. I don't know who it was, but I do remember hearing that during the Depression, all the college-age kids or high school, everybody could get a job in that area because whoever it was with the coal yard was good to them. And then one person married into the Foster family in Manchester/Claremont, who had the sausage factory. And her husband is still alive. His name is, I want to say Jerry Silverberg. Her ex-son-in-law, her son-in-law is still alive. Goldie is dead. And it's through that connection that I found this lady here. But again, I've had no contact. As a kid, I went probably to a couple of bar mitzvahs in Keene. As a kid, I probably went to a bar mitzvah or two in New Bedford, but that was my father's family, and my grandmother was a tough lady and didn't endear people to her easily, though she had a great struggle to support her family and raise her kids. And I think the Stones are still in Keene, and the Fosters, who are by marriage, were a fairly prominent family. But what I remembered in meeting Roz Rosenblatt on the phone was, she was lonely in New York, but she said, why'd you go to New York? She said, because I needed to get married, and there weren't any Jews to marry in Manchester.
I was going to ask about that because you're talking about, this family marrying that family, this family, and there's Lewiston, and then Keene, and New Bedford.
They married where there were Jews.
Yeah.
And they also went to where there were Jews. I think that is, in part true, where there was somebody from their village or somebody they knew. I mean, the first one, how the hell do I know why anybody in his right mind would go to Lewiston if you had a choice? On the other hand, having spent some time working for Humphrey, why the hell did anybody go to Minnesota? I mean, other than Scandinavians, why would anybody go through that grueling trek to freeze to death? Familiarity. Or maybe there was one person there from way back. So, I mean, that's the best I can do on my dad's, and I'll send you whatever stuff I have. I'm impressed as I've come to know them. My dad died 3 years ago, so that's when I moved back home. And in the year or year and a half prior to that, I got my husband's gone. I got my dad back in touch with his cousins whom he hadn't seen in 40 years in Newport. So we got to do that trip, and they came up and met my mom and that kind of stuff. So that's basically what I can tell you about that part of my dad's history. I feel very good about, sort of their having been around a while.
Leaving aside the what you might call the history, I mean, what do you remember him telling you? Let's say, he's telling you about going to school or
most of what he talked about was after he moved to New Bedford, being a newspaper boy and being a Boy Scout and doing all the things. My sense is my dad's family very much assimilated very early. So that even though his parents came here as young adults, they assimilated very fast. I mean, when I was in graduate school in New Haven, the person I shared a house with was from New York. And she said, what do you mean your father was a Boy Scout? That's insane. Jews aren't Boy Scouts. Sorry, I was a Girl Scout. My mother was a Girl Scout. My father was a Boy Scout. They joined the community. And sort of that's been my sense all along. I know there was anti-Semitism. Certainly I hear more about it I've heard more about it from my mom than my dad, although he had an incident at the yard, and I think subsequent to that retired early. But they were much more assimilated and of the outside community. I mean, even here, what I remember I was 12 or 13 or whenever you joined, do you know the Masons at all?
I know of them.
Okay,
yeah.
Well, the sort of precursor to being a grown-up Mason is for boys D-Malay and for girls Rainbow Girls, and then for the men it's Masons, and for the women it's Eastern Star. And when I was, however old one was, 12, 13, 14, when joined that group, I withdrew my application. I got on some sort of bandwagon because they admitted the town tramp and blackballed the only black girl who was in our sort of class. But my grandmother on my father's side was royally pissed because my grandmother, even though she spoke poor English, grandmother was an Eastern Star, my grandfather was a Mason. It's part of the tradition. And my father, much more I think than my mom's family in general, had more of an open comfort in the Christian world. I mean, at one point he worked at Clemson, Texas A&M. He came here to work in the Navy Yard. I mean, when he had to drop out of MIT, he needed some way to make a living, so he did some work at a textile school in New Bedford, ultimately finished up at UNH and did get his degree, and then did some other work at MIT. But you know, he went to Whitensville to work in the mills. He found his way, and as a not very aggressive guy, he did very well. He was beloved, as it turns out most of his cousins are. Just delightful, gentle men, and comfortable in that world. I mean, I've been going to funerals at the Masons. My dad was master of St. Andrew's Lodge. When I didn't join, I mean, I'm thinking now, do I want to join Eastern Star before I die? Maybe I do. I'm not sure. But it was a shock and a disappointment to my grandmother that I didn't become involved in the women's part of Masons. Mm-hmm. And my grandmother was no spring chicken.
And he did this, you know, I guess you're saying assimilating, while nonetheless maintaining a Jewish identity?
Very strong. Yeah, very strong. I don't know that my father ever believed in God, but you wouldn't tell George Sherman that. But my father was a regular until this horrible rabbi basically drove him out of the synagogue for 2 years. We have a real... don't talk to Richard about it, he may pop a vessel. My maternal grandfather was one of the founders of the synagogue. And my dad was a regular, and for years when we didn't have a rabbi, he and this cadre of men, among them George Sherman, basically did all the services, did all of that stuff. It's an important part of their lives. And when I gave the eulogy at my dad's funeral, I said, you know, he was a wonderful husband, much better than my mother deserved, a remarkable father, my best friend in the world. Proud to be an American, proud to be a Jew, proud to be a Democrat, proud to be a Mason. I mean, these were the things that made up his life. So he kept all of the things going, and people just loved him. Everybody, the kids on the street would come and play with him, or he would go up and play with him. People adored him. And I think the same is true of certainly his cousins in Newport. So yeah, he did maintain that. Now, he also married into a Portsmouth family. My maternal grandparents are fascinating, because I'm talking to my cousin in Israel who's a holy roller, and I love him. We grew up together, but we're just like on different planets. And he told me that, and I can't tell you which, I talked to him a couple weeks ago because his mom just died. Either my maternal grandmother or my maternal grandfather had 6 siblings, came to this country, and in the old days, the rumor, you didn't get the name that you came with, was my father. It was my grandfather's family. My grandfather's family's name was Comemaker, Camelmacher. That was their business. And as is the case in everybody else who came here, your last name was usually your occupation. Mm-hmm. Well, they weren't given the right at that point to pick their name, to keep their names. They were given, in my grandfather's case, a series of names to choose from. Again, this could be myth.
At Ellis Island or one of those places?
And they were all identifiable as Jewish: Goldberg, Goldbaum, Goldstein. So my grandfather took Goldstein. According to my cousin in Jerusalem, he had 6 siblings. They all came at different times, and they were all given different last names, which I had never heard of. I assumed at least there was a family name that was constant through the family, and that was not the case, because I didn't know much about my grandfather's family. I mean, there was a sister in Boston, and certainly anybody that was in my grandfather or grandmother's family that was in the Boston area, we saw. What their names were, God only knows, but we saw them. And we saw them regularly. And the historian of that part of the family is my aunt who just died. Mm-hmm. And she didn't keep anything written down. It was all in her head.
But the maternal side of your family ended up here in Portsmouth?
Yeah, they came to... My grandfather came here ostensibly ahead of the Cossacks, and ostensibly a good-looking young blonde, blue-eyed guy who probably could have passed, but he came. And he became a peddler, and he did whatever people do with donkeys or mules or horses or whatever in the country, and went to Somersworth, New Hampshire. God knows why, probably because there was a Jewish family in Somersworth. And then a few years later brought my grandmother over, who was very young, very talented, probably not terrifically happy about...
Brought her over from
Europe,
Russia. Yeah.
Right. And she was an apprentice in either a tailoring or a women's fashion house. she wasn't too happy about coming here and starting with nothing and being married to a peddler. But she came because I think even at 14 or whatever, she was in love. And according to more recent information, when he got married, the place where he was a boarder wouldn't take a couple. So there was another Jewish family named Friedman, parents of the late wife of a guy who's still alive here, who made room for both of them in their home, I think in either Dover or Somersworth. Because my grandfather was on the road a lot, my grandmother was very pretty, all the French-Canadian guys would come hustling her. And he felt very uncomfortable leaving her at home, so ultimately they moved, I think, to Portsmouth.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather was a junk dealer. Ultimately got a Texaco station in the scrap metal business. And was about to make his fortune, I gather, and shipped out 100 cars of scrap metal out of the train station. And it all got shipped back because it was 1928 and the market crashed. But my grandfather had 5 or 6 siblings in this country. My grandmother similarly had some siblings. I know far less about her family, yet I would lay you odds I probably met more of them than my grandfather's family. They based themselves around Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Not Maine, not New Hampshire. They based themselves around Boston. And what I remember about them was food, religion. I mean, the kinds of business. They were shopkeepers for the most part. Some were educated. My mom was, and Grammy had all these kids. And what she would do for money or not for money was she would make elegant clothes for the ladies who had no money. And that was her pleasure and her joy. And she raised her kids. And my grandfather worked a lot. And my grandfather assimilated also. I mean, he'd hang out after work, all these guys in blue-collar jobs. Grandpa Simpson from across the street was an Irish guy. He was a friend of his. And they'd all go over to a bar and they'd have a shot of whiskey and then they'd go home for supper. And what my grandfather wanted to do was read the paper and study. The house belonged to my grandmother. She could have used something else. But my grandfather was very well liked. Again, was one of the 2 families that bought pews in the synagogue. So I still have I have a title to a pew, as does a friend of mine at Yale, whose uncle just died and gave it to him, or left it to him, and he joined the synagogue. My grandparents, the whole area that is the colonial restoration area was the ghetto. And it wasn't just a Jewish ghetto, but it was the ghetto. And that's where my mother grew up, and then they moved up to the same street the synagogue was on, which was a big deal. And what I remember hearing is there are some very, quote, successful people in the family. I've met some. There was an Uncle Herschel, Henry, who died probably 20 years ago. I met him when I was 17 when we went to Miami because I had mono and I needed to get away, so my family found an excuse to take a vacation. My parents are very modest means. And Uncle Herschel had been a stone layer and a bricklayer, and he had been involved in building some of the wartime housing here. And then moved to Miami and was a bricklayer, I guess, in building the old Miami. Mm-hmm. And he had a daughter whom I'm now in touch with, who recently lost her husband, who I think is college educated and lives in Scarsdale or someplace like that, and is about to celebrate her 80th birthday. Again, sort of upwardly mobile, well educated. In my mom's immediate family, of her immediate siblings, there was her brother, who became a pharmacist. 2 sisters, all of them were deceased. There's one sister who was very pretty and went to work to help in Boston, changed her name from Goldstein to Young so she could get a job at the phone company. And another who had MS, who was kind of tragic and kind of sets a tone for the family as a caretaker role for my mom within the family. My mother was the only person in the family to go to college. and she went to UNH. Notably, she is reported to have hitchhiked a bit to get back and forth, because she also worked for my grandfather at the gas station and the junkyard. She reports anti-Semitism. This is the only place I have felt anti-Semitism. New Hampshire.
In this town?
This town, this state. I went to Harvard, I went, to Washington, I moved around a lot, and I clearly have lived in a Christian community more than my mom certainly has. But she talks about as a kid in downtown Portsmouth being called Jew bitch, as she and her siblings, her sisters, would be walking to school in the morning. One of the neighbors, or two of them, would come out and start just screaming Jew bitch at her. She talked about, the old tradition of Jewish men could go out, boys could go out with whoever they wanted to, but girls are sort of kept aside because, God forbid, the lineage and the heritage gets transmitted through the maternal side. When she went to the university, my mother was a champion tennis player. And when she went to the University of New Hampshire, she was rushed by several sororities. And their condition, when it came time to admit her, was that she take her religion off of all the forms, the official forms in the school. And she said no. So she never joined a sorority, and she never became part of that life. As it turns out, my best friend's mother, whose maiden name was Regan, was also at the university with her, and the two daughters have become friends serendipitously as it's occurred. And she graduated from the University of New Hampshire, did some work as a TA there, continued to do some graduate work in psychology, though she never finished a graduate degree, and subsequently went off to Florida to work, and then was very happy. Just loved it. I gather it was sort of a Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movie. Came back here because, in fact, her sister was diagnosed with MS, and her brother certainly wasn't going to get involved in the care, and my other aunt was, I think, not inclined to be a caregiver. That would be a kind way to put it. And came back here, went to work for her dad, took over the business for a time, took care of her sister. When my aunt married, she married my dad. My dad didn't want to take over the business after my grandfather died, and it was a mistake. My mother was a brilliant businesswoman, and just it was the wrong time for women. But she maintained, and they both were intrinsically part of the synagogue here and Jewish life. It really defined our lives. It's where their social circles were, it's where their friends were, it's where their spiritual life was, it's where their events and celebrations were. It was really a very tight and very supportive community, and most of the people were merchants. Most were not educated. Most, unlike my family, made an incredible amount of money. There weren't Jewish teachers here. There were 2 Jewish teachers in the Portsmouth school system. They didn't hire Jews to be teachers in those days. And they had one man who was a brilliant musician and very popular, another guy who's still alive, who said he left because he couldn't live on $700 a year, and then one other person, a sister of the music teacher, who became a teacher. But there were no Jews teaching school. There were no Jews working for the phone company. There were lots of things that were closed to Jews here, and that was something that was sort of drilled into me very early on. And so because of that, I think the synagogue was, and the community was central. My mom, I think, was a member of the Women's Cities Club. She was a member of the League of Voters. She was on the board or something of the USO, but usually as the representative of the Jewish community, or one of them. And there was a good deal of sharing at that level in the community, and my assumption is it was probably more Protestant and Jewish than it was Catholic and Jewish.
So was the pattern then that, say, post-World War II, 1950s and onwards, that Jewish kids growing up in a place like this would leave?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Some did, some didn't. I'm trying to think. Those, as is the case with New Hampshire, if you had anything on the ball and you wanted to go any place or do anything, you left. And what New Hampshire has been characterized has been a bunch of mediocre folk without much drive or much necessarily skill who kind of stayed around and did what they did or did what their parents did, and then suddenly New Hampshire boomed for any number of reasons and they became important. Most of the really bright people left. Most of the really creative people left. Have they come back? Yes, some. I mean, would I ever have come back? I'm an only child. I didn't have a whole lot of choice. And my parents had a good run. They had a good run of being able to travel and do things together in relatively good health. So I moved to Washington, and then I did some other stuff, and I went to graduate school. And I moved to Israel for a while because I was involved with someone there. Then we moved to Mexico. So I had a lot that was available to me because they had good health and adequate resources to live non-institutionally. Most of the kids left. There is a dentist in town who didn't leave. He came back. He was in my high school class. Of my high school class, I think I'm the only Jewish kid that came back, and there were probably 6 or 7 of us in that class. The class ahead of me, there's a kid at the beach whose family owned a hardware store. There were some people that stayed, but most everybody left. There was no reason to come back. So now what you have is a few folks like me who have come back, but who have real roots in this community. There are still pictures someplace in the house of the hookers down in the horse-drawn wagons on North C Street, which was right there where my grandparents lived. But there are all these people from away, and they're driven only by money and by other kinds of considerations. They have no sense of community.
It characterizes more recent influx.
Yeah, I mean, the synagogue is probably 50% or more intermarried, closer to 70, some would argue. So there's now an additional, and I gather this is tradition, there's an addition to the cemetery for mixed marriage burials. Which, I mean, the Portsmouth Synagogue, according to my dad at one point, in the early days, and my dad really got fascinated with this, there were 3 religious groups here in my grandparents' day. The socialists, who were really not religious, and then 2 other sects. One, ultimately they ended up with an old Methodist church downtown or an old Presbyterian church downtown, which is a wonderful, simple building, thank goodness. But the burial grounds are the burial grounds, and then over to the left, way in the back, are the socialists. They aren't buried with everybody else. And now, kind of representing the change of further assimilation, is there's an additional plot that's just been bought so that people can be buried with their spouses even though they're not Jewish. I think that has characterized in many ways the change. Also, and it isn't just the Jewish community. There is no community. I mean, there is a community of wealth, and there's, to a lesser extent, I suppose, a community of influence, but there isn't a community of real sharing. There are pockets of it, but really very little. It doesn't... I mean, I've moved around a lot, and I've moved in a lot of circles, but I mean, I find these people just so ridiculously materialistic. I can't think of anything that I'd want to do or say with them. When this rabbi came to visit my mother reluctantly 10 years ago when she was at death's door, he was both relieved that she was unconscious, and then came to me and said, well, I understand you went to Harvard and Yale, and I think we should have an intellectual conversation. I said, I don't, goodbye. But I mean, there's that kind of using. But there's also, because of that, I mean, what brings people together seems more to be pseudo-community. And I don't think it's just Jewish. I think it's what's happening as this has become a suburb of Boston. And I don't know if it's happening as much further north, but when I was at Hebron, I talked to the widow of the school principal up in Lewiston, and she said that her kids had left. Her daughter was a physician someplace, and all the kids had left. They had gone someplace else because they could get a better education. I don't know it was because of the Jewish so much, although in my case I think it was. But also the lack of opportunity and the lack of stimulation, and I'm sure that box has a lot to do with it. You know, you don't sit and people don't read newspapers. They get whatever they get. And I lived with a correspondent for 15 years. So, you know, I have that sense. But they don't listen to the radio. They don't come together as a community in other ways that I think I tend to idealize, because maybe it wasn't so hot out. I don't know. But she had said that her kids had left. One was a lawyer, one was a doctor. My mother's cousin, who's turning 80, has, believe it or not, a son who's married to a German national who lives in Berlin. A daughter who lives in California, does something with the movies. A son who's teaching computer science someplace, and a daughter who is very nice, and I can't remember what she does. Not one of them lives near, where the family started. Well, that's not true. Two of them live in the family home in Boston. Mom had moved away, and two of the siblings had moved away. My family, the Newport family, two of their three sons live in the Newport area. I think there's probably more cohesiveness in the Keene family, but of the people I know, everybody left. And it's not just my family. But I probably, like many of the people in my family, unlike some of the people around here that I grew up with, I went far away. The kid who grew up across the street went to, Alabama to do his doctorate. There wasn't a whole lot here. It was charming, it was lovely, the beach, you had all this great stuff. Here in Portsmouth, the waterfront, part of the waterfront, because it was the ghetto where Strawberry Bank is, was called Palestine Beach. People would just jump off into the river. And apparently that's where the Jewish folks would take their families for their outings during the day. Most people, my sense, is left, and so in coming back, you bring some idealized vision and version of what you left. But I certainly have no interest in joining. And I find that amazing. It depends on whether you're sort of a pre-70s person or a post-70s, or even a pre-75 person. Because after that, there's just been all this other kind of change. I think there's a fairly good community here in terms of religious education for the kids. I think that's where the bond may be forming now. But I don't have the sense of community among the adults. Mm-hmm. Now, Richard, when you talk to him, and his wife, who is a converted Jew from Chicago, whose parents are Polish immigrants, Richard is very much part of a pro-Israel, I don't know, I can't describe it, but they're part of a Jewish group. They have Shabbat dinner either every Friday or Saturday night. Their kids all speak fluent Hebrew. They're much more trained. They're more violently pro-Israel than and I lived in Jerusalem for a while. Some have done Aliyah, some have not. But it's much more sort of here as their identity, rather than here. I mean that's my sense of it, and they're wonderful people. But you can't talk about the Middle East or other things, and yet I enjoy being around them. There's a limit to community.
Mm-hmm. When were you in Israel?
Well, when was I? When did I go back to school? I went back to school when I was old. I was back and forth. I started graduate school in August of 84. So from August of 83 till August of 84, I was back and forth because I was involved with a guy who was living there, working there. And then he got transferred to Mexico and I went back to school. But I went there. The other thing is that I think, and this is probably different and maybe it's delusional, but I feel more American than I think some of these other people do, or more of a I'm very much, a Jew culturally and ethically. But I recently spent some time with an acquaintance, friend, whatever, this past fall, and, what are you doing for Thanksgiving? Well, it's an American holiday. I almost fell out of my chair. Excuse me? Hello? And said with incredible, it doesn't really matter. Well, that's true. Nothing really matters. If you get,
but this is an American-born
This is
Jew.
an American-born Jew who has a much stronger religious affiliation or religious heritage than I. Though God knows I had to go to Hebrew school and I had to go to Sunday school, and my father taught kindergarten and Sunday school, and I had to go down and get the kids to lock themselves in the bathroom out. I mean, there was, again, community, and I can tell you every kid that locked himself or herself in the bathroom who was 5 years old. So I had that training, but I was absolutely astonished to have someone say, well, that's an American holiday, I don't really observe it. It sort of struck me as strange. I mean, I'm not saying that we don't live our own sufferance, we do. On the other hand...
Well, the generation of people that raised you was clearly, and I can identify somewhat because I have a parent of that same generation, was very interested in becoming part of the American fabric.
My mother and father never gave up or denied or ran from.
Oh, of course, no. I don't mean that
But
there
that
was any
also
denial
happened,
of it, but it was. You could be a Jew and you could be an American.
You could be
simultaneously.
both. Yes.
You could be a Mason, and that didn't mean you were relinquishing your heritage. And
I've seen other people move to belong. I mean, I went to Harvard. Come on, I went to Harvard when everybody was hustling to have no Jewish-sounding last names. My college roommate and I were sort of keeping a list. I don't know, we were sort of enjoying all those gorgeous men. But it didn't... And then after about 6 months, I turned to her and said, we're both acting like we're not Jewish. It's because we both came from environments where I wasn't allowed to go out with Christians. I did. You'd sneak out. But I wasn't allowed to, and I interestingly had said to my dad a couple of years before I died, I said, why, what was this craziness? He said, well, I don't know. It's what we did. It's the way it was. I said, would you still insist on it? And he said, absolutely not. Every one of my father's peers has at least one child who's married.
my background is kind of an interesting one because my mother's from Israel. My dad was from Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Really?
And Jewish also. He met her there. He was on sabbatical. He's still alive but retired. He was a biochemist. So he was at the Weizmann Institute.
Oh, really?
In the 60s, early 60s. My mother was a secretary there.
He courted her.
He courted her. He was a recent...
Does she like it here?
She's still here.
And he is?
He's still here. He lives in outside New York. Yeah, she left. She grew up on a kibbutz, and she was one of those.
That sounds so
one
great.
of those people who was glad to have grown up on a kibbutz, but really was not a socialist at heart, and from early childhood didn't like the idea that she couldn't have her own toys, and so she's done perfectly well in terms of Americanizing in that respect. She's very glad to, but the kibbutz itself, for that matter, has changed too. I mean, they're now they all have their own TVs and their own houses and so on.
And they're also very commercial. I know when I was first visiting Israel, and I visited my Orthodox cousin with some trepidation because we all had questions about his. Anyway, he married late in life and had, I think, 7 or 8 kids. So he now has a 9-year-old and he's in his late 60s and he has grandchildren. But I visited with them and delighted in his young family, but realized that he had gone to Brandeis and his brother had gone to Brandeis in the first class through, and that there wasn't a whole lot that we had in common other than family. And he started putting some pressure on me about moving to Israel. And I said, well, I have fought my whole life to be able to get the same jobs guys do. I mean, I went to work at the White House and I was a typewriter, for Christ's sake. I mean, guys who were in my class at Harvard whose grades are far worse than mine had significant salaries and some responsibilities. What would I do here? This is such a sexist society. And he said, you don't understand, Evelyn. People have longed to not have to work hard. The kibbutz ideal is dead. And so, in effect, your mother's coming here wasn't such a surprise if what he said was true.
Yeah, I mean, she's there. Everybody else in her family is still there. And a lot of them are still on the kibbutz. Oh, her brother has raised 6 kids on the kibbutz. Some of those kids, their kids are still there. I mean, it is remarkable, and the kibbutz goes back to the 1920s.
My father's sister, who went to Smith, and whose husband went to Harvard, had 2 daughters, the older of whom now lives in Florida, but she went to Swarthmore and at some point was the only Jew on a Scandinavian kibbutz. And she spent the whole damn summer flicking chickens. That wasn't exactly how she wanted to spend her life. But she has found a place for herself in kind of a spiritual, intellectual Jewish community in Florida now. And that is very important to her. But her sister, however, is sort of a New York City businesswoman and quite aggressive and quite successful and is married, a Christian fellow who's quite nice. But I don't know how we got off on this, so stop me.
How since you had opportunity to see the synagogue in action when you were younger and now you've come back here, how has the religious practice evolved, would you say?
I am told by a friend of mine whose father was the rabbi here and who died actually at the Rotary Luncheon, who my dad got into Masons, but I'm told that this is a community that could never hold a rabbi or congregation because there was so much bickering, I mean, culturally, and that on the other hand, we now have a rabbi who has stayed because he's a rabbi who can't have a congregation. This man has zero empathy. But he plays to the denominator, whatever the most common denominator is out there. I mean, you can't get him to go. And he walked into this house after my father died, and my best friends were here, and her brother's a priest, and they were making sandwiches. And when he left, they said did he have any understanding at all that this was a house of mourning? He was so cold and so unfeeling. But he really respects boundaries. And there is a community life here that does go on at the synagogue. I really don't want to go to somebody's house and buy jewelry. That's not that's not who I am. Or let's sit around and do this, that, and the other. It's more social, but it's not real. There are a few really superb folk in this community, and Richard knows most of them. But he didn't leave. Both of his sisters did. Harriet's in Boston and Barbara's in New York, though Barbara now has a house here. I just think of them as, it's just a different level of community. There is an active religious school. What's different is it used to be staffed by volunteers. Now it's got paid staff. The synagogue has, I think, a fairly good Friday night service, and I would imagine the kids come to that a lot. And one of the things this guy has done is brought kids into things, and so they like him. He's a good teacher. He's not much else, but he's a very good teacher. My dad always went to Saturday morning services until this guy basically drove him out, as he did some other people, but basically he made the old-timers. My dad used to do conversions with the group of, I think he resented them. My father was also the gabbai. He did get re-involved, and he was the gabbai until he died. So there is community. It's just not, and this may just be generational, have nothing to do with being Jewish or not. Is what does community mean to somebody who grew up in the 50s and 60s versus what does community mean to somebody in the 90s. I don't sense it. I'm closer to my next door neighbors, and they've only lived there for 2 years. And the ones before them, she used to be a nun. I did one of my graduate degrees at Catholic. You know, I got to know the nuns. They're pretty good ladies, and some of the priests as well. I just don't get it. The level of connection I want with people who are part of my life has to be substantial, or it's not. And I think for most of these people, it has to do with what they do or what they have, and that's a much more superficial way of connecting. That doesn't mean to say there aren't some people there who are wonderful. There's a young couple whose little girl, actually I just put the kids' pictures away, whose little girl fell in love with my dad as soon as she could crawl. And that connection stayed. And so she would hurl herself at him. She would sit with him in synagogue services on Saturday until the rabbi would tell them to shut up. And I, with my dad's passing, have inherited her husband, who's my doc. She's Orthodox. She was served in the Israeli army. She's from the United States. She said she went to Israel. She had a good go there. She enjoyed it. She said, if I'm going to be here, I'm not going to just mouth off about it. I'm going to join the army. So she put in her time. She has a doctorate in microbiology or marine microbiology and came back and somehow ended up here because of the university and married this great doc. They have 2 terrific kids. I value them because they're just wonderful, real people. And they do, like myself, hold him in some disdain or contempt. But these classes are good for the kids. They have a preschool now. They have a lot of programming because the community is also grown. And while I would say more than half of the community is mixed marriage, the community has grown and avails itself. I mean, it's really easy religion. You know, it's sort of like McDonald's. Or it doesn't take anything. And it doesn't require anything. So I can't. Mm-hmm. I mean, Annie's younger than Annie and Rob are young. Rob just turned 50. And Annie's much younger than Rob, but there just isn't the same sense of community. And on the other hand, I know so many of my friends from college and graduate school move around so much. What's their community? It's their family. The soccer mom, the other soccer moms, or my best friend from Yale is managing the finances of the medical school. I mean, when you work 15-hour days and you get 2 kids, there's a limit, and yet she's formed a community, and she's sort of superwoman. But she and I are more connected than some of the people here. And she's a good 15 years younger than I. So I guess some of it may well be generational in terms of what I expect, or what I need to feel comfortable, or what I need to feel interested.
Is it a conservative congregation, Orthodox?
In my grandfather's day, the women sat upstairs when they first got here.
So that was...
No, Grammy sat downstairs,
yeah.
But she didn't sit with my grandfather because she wanted to sit with the ladies. My grandmother was not illiterate, as I think many of the other women were. But there were also some very powerful women in that community. There's a large regional paper company here called Portsmouth Paper. It's owned by an extended Jewish family, Goodmans and Koskers and whatever. And it was started by one of Grammy's friends. I mean, she had either an absentee or dead husband and ne'er-do-well son. She had to make a living. She started this company. She was all by herself. I'm sure she was a paper peddler to start with, and had nobody to leave it to. So she left it to nephews and nieces. And it's an established part of the community here, and very few people know that these families didn't start it, but rather she did. So there were some strong women in that earlier time. But most women were just sort of beaten down by having to pass full of kids and taking them together. But Grammy sat so she could chat with her friends. My mother, my father, and I always sat with my maternal grandfather. I mean, I remember playing with his tallest when I was little, and he died when I was 5. And the original folks here still sit in the same pews their parents sat in, and there is that continuity. And it's I want to say, what is it? United Conservative. I want to say it's like the United Church of Christ, United Synagogue something. It's a conservative synagogue.
So the middle.
Yeah,
the middle,
and it's very palatable. I mean, it demands absolutely nothing, and it gives back a lot. I mean, it gives back. The kids get to go through their bar mitzvahs. The kids get to do the schooling, which I think is better now than it has been in the past. It's the one thing that I think it is better with this fellow. There's a Reform congregation in Dover, and the guy who is the rabbi there came out at Rosh Hashanah.
Okay, I've heard of him.
Lev Barshish.
Yeah.
His name used to be Wes O'Donnell.
Oh.
He changed his name. I think he also used to be a lawyer, but that's like, what did George Burns say? Saying he used to be a Jew is like saying he used to be a hunchback. When he became a man of the cloth, he took a more Jewish sounding name.
Mm-hmm.
And his lover or partner was studying nursing and working at medical records at a nursing home in Dover where my mom was getting rehab. I like him a lot, and there's a part of me that has said, if I could take I won't give up the pew, but if I could take the pew and move it. I feel sort of an obligation. I'm paying these people $700 a year to belong to a synagogue I don't go to, except once maybe or twice a year, because it was my grandfather's, and I can't not let it go. Now that Dick Silverman from Yale has taken his uncle's thing, I said, well, okay, so if I leave, I can deed you, because I can't deed it to anybody else, but he also is from the beginning family, so I could do that. I would go to Dover. I think it's a much more inclusive place. I've also seriously considered looking at the Unitarian Church. And there was a rather remarkable minister here who was the rabbi's best friend. And he and I had some talks about my at least starting to go there, and then he died suddenly in like 52 or 53, boom. And this has been a place where the Christian clergy has been very welcoming. I mean, the guy who got me most of my local scholarships lived 2 houses in back of us when I was in high school and was a congregational minister. And one of the Episcopal priests' wards and I were lifeguards together. So there's been much more openness, I think. But it is conservative. It's very palatable. People go 3 days a year. The kids go, and then for the holidays. Not that unusual, I would assume, in many communities. A certain cadre of people go every Saturday. Some go every Friday, because it's usually when they have kids doing stuff. I don't.
Was the earlier generation, were they all pretty much all Russian?
As
Jews?
opposed to, there
Well,
was
as opposed to, I don't know.
one dark-skinned family, and they were not. But they were. This is awful, but it's truthful. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and they said, "Oh, they were skanky." I said, "Excuse me?" They said, "Well, they didn't dress the same way." They were very poor, but they also had a tiny little store. I guess. The expression, though it has nothing to do with geography, was that they were from the wrong side of the tracks. There was a little guy he was white, he was Russian, Russian or Lithuanian or what, Eastern European. I don't think that there were many Sephardic Jews here. I think the Sephardi might have been in, I'm not sure, maybe that was part of the Truro group in Newport.
The early Truro group, yeah.
And my guess is they're still there, or some of those families are still there.
I talked to somebody who grew up in Rhode Island, was telling me that her parents were Russian, and she said that her entire growing up in Rhode Island, she never met one of those Sephardic
Really?
Jews, and that was not necessarily because they were gone, but because there was just,
We're edged out.
yeah.
The earliest family that I know of here is, I think, either Episcopalian or Congregationalist now, but the family name is Peyser, Peyser. The family home is about 2.5 blocks that way. It's one of the big houses in Portsmouth, not Fuller's or Adams's or whatever, Cabot's. But at some point, as I think I think there were Jews here during the Revolution. And it may be in George's history. If it's not, and he talks to you, there were, but I think they've all assimilated and all converted. It must have been pretty lonely. Because the Peyser family that I know married my father's best friend into my father's best friend's family. And they were all Episcopalian. So at some point, the marriages occurred and the being absorbed into the community occurred. I think it's only, my read is, it's only with the Russian Jews coming that there was a significant enough body of folk that they could maintain some cohesiveness. My grandfather's joy was going to the synagogue and, after work, reading and thinking. And I know they got the Yiddish language newspaper, but I think my grandmother only read that, or my grandfather occasionally, but he was much more, he would have liked to have been a scholar. But I think the one dark-skinned family I can remember, I mean, they found a place in the Portsmouth community. They just didn't have a place in the Jewish community.
Yeah.
They did have a place. I mean, I remember that the son and daughter had friends, but they were, and this is terribly sad, but lower class friends.
One of the things that I remember that my mom told me from her growing up was her parents were Czech and Austrian, and the kibbutz that she came to was primarily Czech, Austrian, German Jews. There was a neighboring kibbutz that was Russian, and
considered peasants, right?
Exactly.
Yes,
that was the distinction. And she said there was one time when these Russian kids were playing over there. They were playing over,
right, the flat cheek slaps.
And a child was hurt, and the Russian child getting hurt said "I," and my mom and her friends were flabbergasted because when you get hurt, you say "ow," you don't say "I," and that
I've never heard of "I."
Well,
was a Russian expression?
Yeah, I guess, but that was just that was unheard of that anybody would say "I" getting hurt, but that's how those Russians were.
Even in Israel, it's the whites and the browns, and I hate to say it, but a lot of the problems that they're having is because the brown folk or the Arabic folk who came in are uneducated, much more isolated, and much easier to manipulate. This is both. Yeah. Maybe the nursing homes. Yeah, I mean, I don't sense the black whiteness, but I am a snob. But I'm more a snob. Where'd you go to school, kind of thing, or what have you done? And I think that's more of a regional kind of experience. Who goes and who stays, and it doesn't have anything to do with what your religion or cultural background is. Although I had a blue-eyed blonde cousin whom I describe in one phrase as my cousin I hate. She became a model and and a starlet and a lot of other things. But I remember that as a dark-skinned person, some of my neighbors, kids, well, she can't be your cousin because you're dark and she's blonde, so she must be Christian. That kind, but that was so when I described this one family as the dark-skinned family, my assumption is they kind of like were gypsies. But I had a patient. I used to do psychiatric social work before I did my MBA, and I had a patient who was a Sephardic Jewish man who was brilliant and but incredibly snobby about being a Sephardic Jew. He really held himself much higher than everybody else because of his lineage, not necessarily because he was observant, because he wasn't, blah, 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 but he had a great sense of pride in where he came from, which was some part of Spain, obviously, way, way back. Anyway, that's all I can offer, I think.
Well, they are, I don't know about this guy in particular, but they were the first Jews to come here anyway, the Eastern European Jews didn't start. Germans started coming in the 1840s.
And I think
the rest came in the 1880s and onward, but the ones that, these Truro people and so on, they were getting here in the 1600s.
And there were, again, it's probably a George's thing. I don't know. I think there were father's grandfather. Could be. Kind of a robust-looking peasant. That's my graduation from cool, Evelyn. Look what these I just dug up. These are my dad's. I think that there were Jews here in the Revolution. I have a friend in D.C., Hank Libby. Hank.
Your phone again.
That's the other one.
Oh, okay.
Hank Libby's parents were in Louisiana during Revolution, excuse me. And they were in the wrong side during the Civil War, needless to say. You might be able to get this at the synagogue. I think you probably can. There is something else here in Portsmouth that he may talk to you about, which is the Shiva Shapiro house. In the
that's part of the
colonial restoration.
Yeah.
There is now. Jeez Louise. There is now. Okay, the first Jews in New Hampshire were William Abrams and Aaron Moses, lived in Newcastle but moved in 1693. The Isaacs came in 1789. Okay, anyway. Shiva was a friend of my grandmother's. And Shiva's family, interestingly, has her descendants are Elaine Krasker is a very powerful political woman in the state and a good Democrat and just a great lady. And it's her family and her husband's family, actually, to whom the Portsmouth Paper Company was handed. Quite wealthy. In addition to the paper company, they have real estate interests, but they're prominent people in the community. And Shiva was her great aunt. Shiva was a friend of my grandmother's. They all came over at the same time because of the prominence of the family. I think that's why it's the Shiva Shapiro house. My mom and dad both talk about the fact that Shiva's husband and his brother worked for my grandfather at some point. We sort of disappeared for a couple of days because they were buying some real estate someplace. But she was a strong woman, probably a rather unhappy woman, but she was, and it's amazing that I remember because my grandmother would take me visiting with her, calling on her friends when I was just teeny. And the house was named for Shiva Shapiro largely because of the influence of the family in the wider community. Elaine Krasker is a wonderful woman. I don't know if she'll want to talk with you or not, but she has a rich family history as well. And unlike me, she didn't leave. Mm-hmm. And she sat in the legislature and the state senate for years and was an advocate for all the right things and retired a few years ago because her daughter was ill. She would be a wonderful person to talk to.
Yeah, I should actually maybe write some of these things. I'll get this title. Where did you get this?
My father's cousin.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go on whatchamacallit, Amazon or something and see if I can get it.
The foster family, I think, also merits some interesting, if you can connect with them at all.
Or Mayor in Manchester?
Well, yeah, and if you'd like, I mean, you can pick one of these up at the synagogue or ask them to send it to you.
Yeah, I think I might do that. Is
It's
just send
Friday,
a
they
note.
may be closed, but you can
Yeah.
give them a call on Sunday. I will do my father's thing and his family. I'm not going to send you pictures because you don't need it. But, yeah. I can send you the family history, the written
Yeah,
history.
thanks. All right, and then there's the Stones and Keene.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
And you ask the rabbi. You want to know who Gordon Stone's. I assume they have a rabbi in
Yeah.
Crete. Ask the rabbi who Gordon Stone's family is and who's
Yeah.
still there and who's not. In Manchester, the people I got with, the woman in New York is Roz Rosenblatt, and she's listed in here.
Uh-huh.
And she's a probably 90 zillion. I may even have her phone number. She's still alive.
Oh, this is the 112-year-old?
No, I'm kidding.
Oh.
So, when I first came across her, it was probably the mid-90s, and I was trying to find some of my dad's cousins because I thought he might very well want to connect with him. I think I have a phone number in here. I may not. Because it's when I start running out of spaces, I just put it any old place. So, Steve Lemire, Soderstrom. Roz Rosenblatt. Okay. She was at 718-646-6573. She's probably in her 90s now. Her address was 2533 Batchelder with a T Street, apartment 4C, Brooklyn 11235.
And she grew up in
Manchester.
In Manchester.
She's part of the Foster
Right.
family and the Foster Meat Company that was in Claremont, New Hampshire. And she had a bunch of siblings as well. If there's anything written other than just charts, I will be happy to make Xeroxes of them. But I know she was charming on the phone, but she was lonely. She was losing her vision to macular degeneration. She had to give up driving. She has a single child in New York. I mean, she has one child who is married to, I think, an academic. And she also inherited of the foster children. There was another who was childless who left when she died, left everything to Roz. So the one person that I connected with before I was in touch with Roz is probably one of the less affluent of the Fosters, and she said that she's probably one of the more affluent. If she's still around, she would, I'm sure, be delighted to get together with you, and she lives in Brooklyn. By now, my guess is she's either living with her sister, living with her daughter, or perhaps in care, but perhaps not. I mean, for her, the real issue was macular degeneration, so that it limited her ability to be independent out in the outside world. I'm trying to think. The other Slome boys have, two of them have just died. Anyway, I do have, I don't know if it's Roz with an S or Roz with a Z, but she's a charming woman. I'm very lonely.
I'll send a little note maybe.
She can't read, I mean, I don't think she can read an email.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I generally, I meant I'll send a note to this
Somebody
mailing
can at
address.
least, I'm trying to see who else. Sarah Moddard, no, she's in Texas. I was fascinated when I found out that Hank Libby's family came over before the revolution and fought in the revolution. I don't know. This just goes on and on and on. Maybe I have the lady in Lewiston, if I can find her name. Waterstrom.